Have you ever wondered how a kingdom with no stone castles and no famous emperors could still rule the oceans like a hidden giant? What if I told you that for centuries, the world's richest spices flowed through one Southeast Asian empire you've probably never seen on a map? Today we're uncovering the entire history of Srivijaya, the spice route kingdom that ruled the seas. This is the story of how Srivijaya rose from mangrove rivers to become the beating heart of maritime Asia. Picture the Strait of Malacca 1,000 years ago. Choking heat, monsoon winds, and a narrow sea lane where every ship between China and India had to pass. In these waters, Srivijaya built an empire not by conquering land, but by controlling movement. At its height around the 8th to 10th centuries, Chinese records describe Srivijaya sending lavish embassies and fielding fleets that could command the main trade corridor of the Indian Ocean. But here's the mystery that still haunts historians. If Srivijaya was as powerful, why did it vanish so completely that even its capital's exact location is debated? Somewhere beneath Sumatra's mud and rivers lies the clue. The river kingdom that learned to command the ocean. Have you ever stood beside a river and felt like it was alive? Like it was watching you back? Now imagine living in a city where that river isn't just water, but your road, your market, your shield, and your secret. That is where Srivijaya begins, not with a crown of gold, but with a river that taught people how to own the sea. It is the late 7th century, and Palembang is waking up. The Mazi River rolls past like a dark mirror, heavy with silt, full of quiet power. Houses rise on wooden stilts. Walkways connect neighbors the way streets do elsewhere, but here the real traffic is on water. Canoes slip between homes. Children learn to paddle before they learn to write. Traders speak in a dozen tongues: Old Malay, Sanskrit, Tamil, Chinese, because in Palembang, languages are not foreign. They are tools. You can smell the city before you see it. Wet wood, cooking rice, smoke from palm oil lamps, and something sharp and sweet unloading in baskets, camphor, resins, spices. There is money in the air, but it doesn't come from farms. It comes from movement. From boats arriving when the winds allow, and leaving when the winds permit. The people here do not pray for rain the way farmers do. They pray for predictable winds, and the winds are everything. To understand Srivijaya, you have to understand the world's heartbeat around it. Between India and China lies a narrow, unavoidable hallway of ocean, the Strait of Malacca. Every ship carrying silk from Guangzhou, cotton from Gujarat, pearls from the Persian Gulf, or spices from the islands beyond Java must pass through this throat. You can't go around it without adding months of danger. You can't rush through without fighting monsoon schedules. The sea itself forces you to stop, to wait, to trade, to negotiate. Now ask yourself this. What happens when one power decides it will own the waiting room? Somewhere in Palembang, a ruler sees the map not as land and sea, but as roots. He sees the Musi and its tributaries as veins feeding out into the coast. He sees the strait as the world's jugular, and he understands one breathtaking truth. You don't need to conquer the world if you can control how the world moves. We meet him in the first surviving whisper of Srivijaya's name. Carved into stone at Kidukan Bukit in 683 CE, the inscription is short, but it hits like a drumbeat through time. It speaks of Dupunta young Sri Jayanasa, a leader who sets out on a sacred expedition with thousands of men and returns in victory. In another kind of empire, you'd imagine armies marching across plains. Here, the expedition smells of river, water, and sea spray. The king's power travels by boat, not by horse. The inscription doesn't list cities captured or kings beheaded. Instead, it celebrates prosperity and success. That choice of words is a clue. Srivijaya isn't announcing itself as a land-grabbing conqueror. It is announcing itself as a controller of flow, a master of corridors. If you're a small coastal port nearby, maybe on Bangka Island or the Malay Peninsula, you feel this new power before you can name it. At first, it might look like protection. Srivijayan ships arrive, sleek and fast, their crews trained in waters you barely understand. They offer an escort for your traders. They help chase off pirates. They share pilots who know the treacherous shoals. Business becomes safer, richer, and safety has a price. Soon you're paying tribute. Soon your harbor flies Srivijaya's banners because refusing would mean something worse than battle. It would mean isolation. The trade ships would stop coming. The middlemen would go elsewhere. Your children would grow up poor not because someone burned your town, but because someone simply turned the rich rivers away from you. That is the quiet cruelty and brilliance of a sea empire. It conquers you without always needing to fight you. From Palembang, the Maharaja builds a web of loyal datas, local chiefs who control river mouths, coasts, and islands. Each one is a knot in the network. Each one matters because, in maritime Southeast Asia, geography is not a single road but 1,000 watery paths. Loyalty can't be assumed. It must be renewed, rewarded, or threatened. You can feel that tension in the Talagabetu inscription, a tall stone carved with curses for anyone who breaks their oath. It is not a gentle text. It is a warning that betrayal will bring ruin, sickness, even death. The stone was likely placed near Palembang where officials and chiefs swore loyalty. Think about the psychology of that moment. A Datu stands before the Maharaja's envoys. The river gurgles beside him. A priest recites the curse. The chief drinks water poured over the stone to seal the oath inside his body. He returns home knowing that the empire is not just watching his harbor. It is watching his soul. But fear alone doesn't build a lasting empire. Srivijaya adds something softer, something deeper. It becomes a Buddhist sanctuary. Chinese monks traveling to study in India begin stopping in Srivijaya. The kingdom offers them safe harbor, teachers, monasteries, and time to learn Sanskrit before crossing the Indian Ocean. One monk, Ye Jing, will later tell of spending years in Srivijaya, describing it as a vital center of Buddhist learning. When a kingdom becomes a spiritual bridge, it gains a kind of legitimacy that ships alone can't buy. Merchants trust it, pilgrims praise it, foreign courts respect it. So, Srivijaya sells the world to stories at once. To merchants, it is the safest, richest marketplace between India and China. To monks, it is a holy stepping stone on the road. To enlightenment, to rival ports, it is a shadow in the strait that can be merciful or merciless. And then the wealth begins to pile up. Here's the secret that made Srivijaya so powerful that even distant emperors took notice. It didn't need to own the Spice Islands to rule the spice trade. Cloves and nutmeg grew far to the east in Maluku. Pepper flowed from Java and the Malay Peninsula. Camphor and resins came from Sumatra's deep forests. Srivijaya's genius was that it owned the funnel where all these treasures had to gather. It controlled the meeting point, the distribution hub, the toll gate. Every sack of spice, every bead of resin, every bale of cloth passed through its hands, and each passage left a portion behind as tribute. Imagine a Gujarati merchant arriving with cotton and glass beads. He must wait for the monsoon to shift before heading to China. While he waits, Srivijaya offers storage and security. He trades his cloth for spices brought by island traders. Srivijayan officials tax the deal, provide a stamp of protection, and send part of the profit of Prover to Palembang. The merchant leaves richer, but the empire grows richer still, and more importantly, it grows unavoidable. This is where Srivijaya steps onto the world stage with a calm confidence that feels almost modern. It sends embassies to China not just to flatter the Tang court, but to lock in recognition. We are the gatekeepers, those gifts say without saying it. Trade through us in your southern seas, stay orderly. China listens because China wants stable trade. India listens because India wants spices and safe sea lanes. The world begins to treat Srivijaya as the natural landlord of the strait. And for a while, nature seems to agree. But here comes the turning point, the first crack in the perfect illusion. A web empire is strong only while its knots hold. Loyalty. In a sea world is always slipping. A chief can rebel without raising a flag, simply by letting foreign ships slip past at night. A rival port can grow rich by offering lower tolls. Pirates can be defeated one year and hired the next. Srivijaya's power is not sitting still. It is constantly swimming. So the Maharaja responds in the only way a maritime ruler can. He expands the fleet. He tightens the oath network. He makes examples of disloyalty. He leans harder into Buddhist prestige, funding monasteries and attracting scholars, so that resisting Srivijaya begins to feel like resisting the moral order of the seas. For decades, it works. The empire spreads across Sumatra's coasts, into the Malay Peninsula, down toward Java, and out into island chains that act like stepping stones for its ships. The sea becomes its throne room. Its soldiers become sailors. Its taxes become tides. And yet, under all this success, a question starts to form like a storm at the horizon. If Srivijaya's strength depends on controlling trade routes, what happens the moment another power learns to sail those routes without needing Srivijaya at all? What happens when a rival fleet appears, not to bargain, but to break the straits? Landlord. The Musi River keeps flowing, calm and brown. Palembang keeps trading, praying, counting. But somewhere beyond the horizon, in the heartlands of India, new dynasties are rising. In Java, new courts are watching. In the seas themselves, the balance of power is shifting in ways Srivijaya cannot yet see. When the sea became Srivijaya's throne Isian, and oceans, once they start listening to you, don't just bring visitors. They bring rivals. The Musi kept feeding Palembang with boats and rumors, but the world beyond Sumatra was getting louder. More ships were appearing every season, bigger ones, braver ones, stacked with cargo that smelled like distant countries. And every one of those captains sailed with the same thought in his chest. Somewhere ahead, the narrow throat of Malacca waits, and whoever owns that throat will decide whether I come home rich or not at all. Srivijaya understood that thought better than anyone. So it stopped acting like a river kingdom pretending to be an empire. It became a true sea power, and the change was almost physical. Like a creature shedding skin, you can feel it in how far Srivijaya's shadow stretched. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Palembang was still the heartbeat, but not the whole body. Out on the coasts and islands, new ports were pulled into its orbit, some by treaty, some by marriage, some by what polite inscriptions call protection and what frightened chiefs would call a choice between obedience and ruin. Srivijaya's mandala, its web of dependent harbors, spread across southern Sumatra, up the Malay Peninsula, and toward the Sunda Strait. The empire's real borders were not lines on land. They were the places where Srivijayan pilots guided ships, where tolls were collected, where local datists knew that their prosperity rose and fell with Palembang's mood. The sea lanes began to look less like a neutral highway and more like a kingdom's private courtyard. At the same time, something else was rising inside Srivijaya like a second heart. Buddhism wasn't just present anymore. It was becoming a pillar of statecraft. In a world where merchants feared storms and pirates more than kings, religion offered a different kind of safety. Monasteries became islands of trust, places where foreigners could rest without wondering if the host would slit their throats in the night. Srivijaya leaned into that. It built, funded, and protected Buddhist centers that made the empire feel not only powerful, but righteous. There's a moment, somewhere around the mid-800s, when Srivijaya's prestige becomes so great that it echoes all the way to Nalanda in India. An inscription there records that a Srivijayan ruler, Balaputradeva, endowed a monastery for pilgrims from his realm. Think about what that means. A king from a watery empire in Southeast Asia is funding one of the most famous Buddhist universities. On Earth, he is announcing to India that Srivijaya is not a remote backwater. It is part of the civilization pipeline itself. Balaputradeva is a fascinating figure because he embodies Srivijaya's next evolution. He was linked to the Sailendra dynasty, a powerful royal house with roots in Java. For a stretch of time, Srivijaya and the Sailendras seemed to fuse into a broader maritime Buddhist elite that could shift influence between Sumatra and Java like moving pieces on a chessboard. Some scholars argued this connection helped Srivijaya secure not only Malacca but also the Sunda Strait, the other crucial gate for ships. Whether through direct rule or alliance, Srivijaya's reach became dual-throated. It could squeeze traffic, heading north through Malacca, or south through Sunda. Now step into the shoes of a merchant in that golden age. You are sailing from China toward India, carrying porcelain, silk, and copper coins. You have heard stories of Srivijaya since you were a kid, stories that make it sound like the sea itself has a landlord. When your ship finally approaches the Sumatran coast, you don't see a fortress. You see movement. You see dozens of smaller craft darting out like fish around a whale, guiding you toward harbor. Pilots climb aboard, calm and confident, speaking your language better than you expected. They point out hidden sandbars and currents. They smile as if they own the ocean, because in a sense, they do. In port, you look around and realize you've entered a living crossroads. Tamil traders from South India bargain beside Chinese clerks. Arab sailors exchange news of the Abbasid world. Javanese captains unload rice and timber. The air tastes like cloves, pepper, and wet rope. Everyone is waiting for the monsoon to turn, and while they wait, everyone trades. Srivijaya collects its share quietly, efficiently, like a tide that never forgets to rise. This is the monopoly that doesn't need a whip. The geography is the whip. And here comes the turning point. The empire's wealth becomes so massive that it reshapes the habits of the world. Chinese records from the Tang and especially the Song dynasties show Srivijaya sending missions over and over, offering gifts, requesting trading privileges, presenting itself as the rightful master of the southern seas. China responds warmly because China's economy is booming and it wants stable maritime routes. Srivijaya becomes, in Chinese eyes, a partner in keeping the sea lanes orderly. But there's a hidden danger in being too important. The more the world depends on you, the more the world starts imagining life without you. somewhere in the 9th and 10th centuries. Tamil merchant guilds from South India are becoming regular visitors in Srivijaya's waters. They are not frightened fishermen. They are organized, wealthy, politically connected, and used to negotiating hard. At first, Srivijaya and these Tamil networks coexist. They need each other. Srivijaya offers access. The Tamils offer goods, silver, and links to India's markets. Peace makes money for everyone. Then, slowly, the peace starts to feel crowded because the Chola dynasty is rising in southern India. At home, they're building temples and armies, but they're also building something else. A navy strong enough to think beyond the Bay of Bengal. The Cholas are traders, but they're also proud rulers who believe glory should travel as far as their ships can travel. Now place these two powers on the same ocean highway. Srivijaya controls the choke points and enforces stops in its ports. The Cholas want smoother access to China and Southeast Asia without being squeezed. Their merchant guilds want fewer tolls. Their king wants prestige. You can almost feel the tension like a rope stretching tighter each year. This is the twist in Srivijaya's golden age. The very system that made it rich, forcing ships to stop, taxing them, positioning itself as unavoidable, so painted a target on its back. A sea empire doesn't just collect wealth, it collects resentment, quietly, invisibly, until the resentment becomes a fleet. Meanwhile, Srivijaya is juggling another problem closer to home. If you're a Mandala empire, your vassals are always testing the rope. Distant chiefs look at the flow of foreign ships and think, why should Palembang take the largest slice? Why shouldn't my port become the new center? In the shadows of the monopoly, slower rival hubs like Malayu and Jambi begin to grow stronger. The web that holds Srivijaya together is still intact, but some knots are loosening. So the Maharaja doubles down. More patrols, more religious patronage, more diplomacy with China. The empire remains dazzling, but it begins to feel like a spinning top that must stay perfectly balanced or fall. And then, in the early 1000s, the seas pick a side not through storms, but through strategy. Far across the Bay of Bengal, Rajendra Chola inherits a throne and a vision. He is not satisfied with being a king of land alone. He wants the kind of fame that crosses water. He hears about Srivijaya's monopoly the way a gambler hears about a rigged table. He listens to Tamil merchants who complain about being delayed and taxed. The motive is still debated, but the direction is not. The Cholas begin preparing an expedition unlike anything Southeast Asia has faced from India. Srivijaya, ironically, can't see the blade coming clearly. It has spent centuries defending Malacca's northern mouth, expecting threats to come through the main hallway. But Rajendra's navy is learning a sharper trick. Approach from the west coast of Sumatra, slip down the island's spine, and enter Srivijaya's world through the Sunda Strait instead. A back door. A door Srivijaya guards less tightly because who in their right mind would cross the open Indian Ocean just to surprise them? That question is about to get answered. The day the Western Ocean turned to fire it starts, strangely enough, with a rumor that feels too ridiculous to take seriously. A fisherman comes upriver to Palembang with a story. He says he saw sails on the western horizon, more sails than he could count, moving in a formation that didn't look like merchants. He says the ships were taller than the local zhong, painted in deep colors, carrying banners he didn't recognize. Men in the market laugh. The Western Sea is wide, they say. Traders come and go all the time. What kingdom would dare cross that ocean just to challenge Srivijaya in its own waters? But rumors are the ocean's way of knocking before it enters. Your house. In the palace quarter, the Maharaja's advisors hear the same story from different mouths. A Malay pilot whispers it. A Tamil trader goes quiet and avoids eye contact. A monk returning from the coast says the ports feel nervous, like birds before a storm. The rumors don't agree on details, but they agree on one thing. Something is coming from the west, and it is not here to bargain. Srivijaya is used to being the one who makes other people nervous. That is part of what makes this moment so unsettling. When you've spent centuries as the landlord of the straits, you start believing the hallway belongs to you by nature, not by effort. You start forgetting that even a landlord can be evicted. The first serious warning arrives not as an army, but as silence. Ships that should have reached Palembang don't show up. A Chinese junk expected in the spring monsoon never arrives. A convoy of smaller island traders vanishes between the western reefs. At first, officials chalk it up to pirates or bad weather. But the pattern keeps growing. It begins to feel less like chaos and more like intention. Then, one hot afternoon, a battered coastal vessel crawls into Palembang's harbor like a wounded animal. Its sail is torn into ribbons. Its hull is scorched. The crew looks half-starved and half-haunted. When they stumble onto the docks, they don't even ask for water first. They ask for protection. There are warships, their captain says, voice rasping like sandpaper, iron-armed men. They burned the port. They took captains alive. They didn't stop for tolls. They laughed at our flags. Now the laughter in the market dies. In a river city, fear spreads as fast as tidewater. People remember the old curses on the O-stone. They remember the power Srivijaya built on being the only safe harbor, and they realize with a cold shock that safety is something that can be stolen. The Maharaja's council meets that night. Old men who once negotiated tribute with distant datas lean over maps of rivers and straits. Younger commanders suggest raising the fleet and sealing Malacca tight, like a fist. But the reports aren't coming from Malacca. They're coming from the west coast, from ports that face the Indian Ocean. Places Srivijaya never worried about because they were too exposed, too far from the choke points. The Maharaja stares at the map and feels the first edge of dread. The enemy isn't pushing through the front door. It's slipping through the back. By the time dawn arrives, the western horizon is no longer rumor. Watchtowers on the coast see the line of sails, black dots becoming teeth. The fleet is Chola, sent by Rajendra Chola I, and it moves like a storm with a plan. The Cholas don't just raid randomly. They hit the nodes of Srivijaya's web one by one, as if they studied the empire's anatomy and decided exactly where to stab. The first major port falls fast. Its defenders are brave, but bravery is not the same as preparation. The Chola ships come in with archers on high decks, with boarding parties trained for violence at sea, with commanders who have already decided that Srivijaya's monopoly is a wall meant to be broken. The port burns, and the smoke rises like a dark announcement to every coastal chief. The sea throne can bleed. Next, they strike deeper. There is a terrifying efficiency to it. Where Srivijaya expects negotiation, they bring shock. Where Srivijaya expects a slow build-up, they bring speed. Where Srivijaya expects fear to be enough, they bring force. And then, the wave reaches Palembang. We don't have a neat eyewitness account of that moment. The river mud keeps secrets too, well, but we can imagine it with unbearable clarity. 100 boats scramble on the Musi, carrying soldiers downstream, forming defensive lines, stringing chains across channels, trying to turn rivers into walls. Again, villagers pull their children inland. Monks gather sacred texts and hide them in baskets. The palace drums beat not for ceremony, but for war. Then the Chola fleet appears at the river, mouth like a nightmare that learned to sail. The battle is chaos. Flaming arrows hiss into wooden ships. Men scream as they slip on blood-wet decks. The Musi River, which once felt like Srivijaya's ally, becomes a trap crowded with badis and broken hulls. Srivijayan pilots know the channels better, but the Cholas have numbers and momentum. Repairs that would take Srivijaya days, the Cholas shrug off in hours. The river city fights like a cornered tiger. And still, the tiger is surprised. This is the climax where Srivijaya's confidence snaps. The Cholas do something almost unheard of in the region's previous wars. They push directly toward the capital, not just to loot but to humiliate. They take the Maharaja captive, maybe briefly, maybe for longer. Historians argue, but the symbol is what matters. The ruler who once stood in the middle of the hallway and decided who could pass is now in the hands of men who crossed an ocean to refuse permission. Palembang survives, but it is shaken in a way no fire in a warehouse could ever shake it. Because every coastal chief now knows Srivijaya can be reached. Every merchant now knows there are ways through the sea lanes that don't require kneeling to Palembang. Every rival port now smells blood. But here is the twist that makes this invasion even more devastating than a simple defeat. The Cholas don't stay. They raid. They burn. They seize treasure and captives, and then they sail home. There is no attempt to govern Sumatra. No desire to sit on the sea throne permanently. At first, it seems like mercy or limitation, but it isn't. It's strategy. By leaving, the Cholas don't replace Srivijaya. They unmake it, because Srivijaya's power depended on the belief that it was unavoidable. The illusion of permanent control was the glue holding the mandala together. When the Chola fleet demonstrates that illusion can be shattered, Srivijaya's vassals begin to rethink their loyalties in the quietest, most dangerous way possible. They don't have to declare rebellion. They just have to stop sending tribute. They just have to welcome foreign ships directly. They just have to whisper to each other that maybe Palembang is no longer the safest bet that the Maharaja tries to repair. The Wib. He sends envoys with gifts to coastal chiefs. He hosts rituals, renews oaths, promises protection. He reaches out to China again, emphasizing stability, begging for recognition to remain on his side. Some knots tighten again. Some don't. And a new center of gravity begins to stir upriver and northward. Malu, the rival power in Jambi, has been waiting for a moment like this. It doesn't need to defeat Srivijaya in a dramatic battle. It just needs to rise while Srivijaya wobbles. Merchants who once automatically stopped at Palembang begin to consider alternatives. Chiefs who once needed Srivijaya to be rich decide they can be rich without it. The empire is still alive, but it is not the same creature. If before it was. A giant crocodile in the river, jaws clamped on trade. Now it is a wounded crocodile. Still dangerous. Still capable of killing. But no longer terrifying enough to freeze the river itself. Years pass. The strait is busy again, but the flow feels different. More bargaining, more competition, less inevitability. Palembang's docks fill once more, but the conversations in the market have changed. People talk about the Cholas the way people talk, about earthquakes, events that don't happen often. But once you've lived through one, you never again believe the ground is truly stable. Every gust of wind from the west feels like a question mark. Every unfamiliar sail carries a thread of old fear, and somewhere in the palace, an aging Maharaja sits listening to the river at night, wondering if Srivijaya stole the river's master, or simply one kingdom among many that happened to live beside it. Because the real danger after a humiliation isn't the enemy who struck you, it's the world that watched you fall. The empire that began to drift, a strange thing happens after a great blow. The world doesn't end. The sun still rises, the river still flows, the markets still open. And that normality can be more frightening than fire, because it makes you wonder whether your empire was ever as permanent as you thought. In the years after the Chola raids, Palembang tried to look unchanged. The docks were rebuilt, the fleets were repaired, the monasteries resumed their chants as if sound alone could stitch reality back together. Envoys went out carrying silk, gold, and carefully measured humility to remind distant chiefs that Srivijaya was still Srivijaya. If you walked the riverfront at dusk, you could almost believe it. Too, ships still came, toll houses still collected, spaces still perfumed the air. But underneath that surface, the empire felt different, like a great ship that has taken on water but is trying to pretend it hasn't. The problem wasn't that. Srivijaya had lost the sea in one dramatic moment. The problem was that the sea had learned it could live without Srivijaya, and once that thought enters a merchant's head, it never fully leaves. The first signs of drift were quiet. A port here would delay tribute, a Datu there would send less than expected. Palembang's officials would scold, threaten, sometimes even sail out with war canoes to remind a harbor who the landlord still was. Often the reminder worked, but it needed repeating, over and over, like a spell losing strength, because the web that held Srivijaya together depended on confidence. Confidence that Palembang's protection was unmatched. Confidence that its pilots were essential. Confidence that skipping Srivijaya's harbors was too risky to consider. The Chola attack shattered that confidence in places far beyond where the flames actually touched. A vassal chief on the Malay Peninsula might never have seen an Indian warship, but he had heard the story. And stories travel through sea routes faster than armies ever could. Now imagine being that chief. Your harbor is busy, your people are prospering, and foreign merchants are arriving with smiles and whispers. Some of them offer deals directly, without involving Palembang. Some hint that the world is changing, that trade is becoming more open, that maybe your port could be a center in its own right. You don't want to rebel outright. That would be foolish. Palembang still has teeth. But you begin to hedge. You begin to test how far you can lean away without snapping free. You are not alone. Across the straits, dozens of chiefs make the same cautious calculation. And while they calculate, another power rises like a tide at night to the north along Sumatra's rivers. Malayu in the Jambi region had always been a rival presence, half in Srivijaya's orbit and half outside it. Malayu didn't need to smash Palembang to succeed. It only needed to become a more attractive stop, a more stable option, a better bargain. After the Chola raids, Malo's chance arrived. Merchants who were once forced by habit to stop at Palembang started stopping elsewhere too. A little here, a little there, until elsewhere became a pattern. Srivijaya still controlled the narrowest part of the hallway, yes, but the hallway had started to grow side doors. There's a particular cruelty in losing an empire this way. If you fall in one great battle, at least you know exactly where the story changed. But when you drift, you can spend decades insisting you're still in control while the world quietly rearranges itself around you. Palembang tried to counter the drift with the tools it knew best. It leaned harder into Buddhism, renewing its image as a sacred crossroads. Monasteries were repaired and expanded. Teachers were invited. Pilgrims were treated generously. The Maharaja wanted the world to feel that Srivijaya was still essential, still righteous, still the stable heart of the seas. Faith can't rebuild burned ships, but it can rebuild trust. And trust was the new battlefield at the same time. The rulers tightened diplomatic ties with China, sending embassies that were almost pleading in their richness. These missions weren't just gifts. They were statements. We still keep your sea lane safe. We are still your partner. Do not look elsewhere. And China, for a while, still listened. Chinese courts liked continuity. Chinese merchants liked order. Srivijaya was wounded, but it was familiar. Yet history doesn't sit still for familiarity. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the maritime world is getting more crowded. Ships from India are sailing more directly. Ports along the Malay Peninsula are growing more confident. Java, in particular, is no longer content to play junior partner in the sea lanes. New Javanese kingdoms build their own fleets and their own ambitions, and they look at the straits not as Srivijaya's inheritance, but as a prize to be won. So now, Srivijaya is fighting on two fronts without calling it a war. On one side, Indian sea power has proven it can strike the monopoly. On the other side, Javanese rivals are growing under the same ocean sun. The empire that once owned the waiting room is now competing inside it. The most painful turning point arrives not with fire, but with avoidance. A new generation of merchants begins to treat Palembang the way travelers treat an old inn that used to be unbeatable but feels less convenient now. They still stop sometimes, especially when storms force the issue, but they don't automatically stop. They weigh options. They haggle harder. They spread risk across multiple ports instead of trusting one dominant hub. For Srivijaya, that shift is like losing oxygen. Its wealth was never rooted in land. It was rooted in habits of trade. When habits loosen, revenue thins. And when revenue thins, fleets shrink. And when fleets shrink, the very thing keeping trade habits alive weakens further. It becomes a spiral, slow but merciless. You can feel Palembang trying to run uphill on a slope that keeps steepening. Officials press chiefs for tribute. Chiefs respond with politeness and delays. Patrols chase pirates. Pirates reappear, sometimes protected by rivals who want the seas to feel less safe under Srivijaya's watch. The Maharaja calls councils, renews oaths, offers rewards. But in a sea world, loyalty is a current. You can't hold it in your hand. And then comes the climax of this long drift. Srivijaya's center begins to shift. It's not that Palembang vanishes overnight. It remains important, still glittering in memory and trade. But foreign records start mentioning other Sumatran powers more often. Influence looks less centralized. The mandala reorganizes itself as if the web is being retied around a new Natua historian. This moment can look confusing, even messy. But to people living through it, it feels like a change in weather. You wake up one season and realize your port is paying tribute to someone else. Or maybe tribute itself has become a flexible thing, a polite gesture rather than an iron rule. The sea doesn't announce regime change with trumpets. It announces it with different ships docking at night. Here's the twist that makes Srivijaya's decline even more haunting. It doesn't stop being Srivijaya in the minds of outsiders. 4 centuries after its peak, foreign travelers and Chinese scribes keep using Srivijaya as a kind of umbrella word for the Sumatran maritime world. Even as its actual political core weakens, its name remains powerful. It's like a brand that outlives the company. That lingering prestige becomes both a shield and a curse. It helps Palembang remain relevant longer than it otherwise might. But it also hides the reality of decline from the people inside the empire. If the world still calls you the Sea King, how do you convince yourself you're no longer wearing the crown? So Srivijaya drifts through the 12th century like a legendary ship with a leaking hull, still impressive from afar, still floating, still feared by some, but no longer steering the ocean the way it once did. And while it drifts, a new force is rising in the background, one that will not raid like the Cholas, and not compete politely like Malayu or Java. This force will change the rules of the sea, highway itself, because the world of trade is about to be remade by a new kind of faith, a new kind of network, and new coastal cities that will claim the spice route for themselves. The kingdom that vanished into the tide is a moment in every empire's life when it realizes it's no longer the main character of the world it helped create. The scary part is that this realization doesn't arrive with a trumpet. It arrives with a quiet sound, like footsteps moving past your door without knocking. By the time the 13th century rolls in, Srivijaya is still breathing, still trading, still praying beside the Musi River. But it is breathing in a different air. The sea lanes are no longer a single corridor controlled by one landlord. They are a crowded marketplace of competing harbors, shifting alliances, and foreign networks that sail with new confidence. And somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the biggest change of all is arriving not as a fleet, but as an idea. Islam has begun to ride the monsoon winds into Southeast Asia, not with conquest armies the way people imagine, but with merchants, mystics, and port communities that find this faith fits the rhythm of maritime life. The new Muslim traders form their own trust networks across the Indian Ocean. They pray together, marry into local families, and build communities that feel instantly connected to faraway coasts: Gujarat, Arabia, Persia Lake, a chain of lanterns across the sea. For centuries, Srivijaya's Buddhism had been one of its greatest advantages. It made the empire a sacred refuge, a cultural bridge, a place the world respected. But now the sacred geography is changing. New ports become Islamic. New markets form around mosques instead of monasteries. A ship arriving from the west can now dock in a Muslim harbor and find not only trade, but a familiar spiritual home. Trust no longer has to flow through Srivijaya's temples. That shift is subtle at first. A few new prayer houses in coastal towns, a few chiefs converting for diplomatic convenience, a few merchant guilds rerouting their journeys because they prefer a port where they share faith with the host. But subtle shifts in trade are like tiny cracks in a dam. They widen without asking permission. The irony is brutal. Srivijaya had once made itself necessary by being the safest, richest, most spiritually prestigious stop between India and China. Now other ports are learning how to be necessary too, using a different kind of prestige, a different kind of trust, and a different kind of network. So imagine Palembang now, not as a roaring capital, but as an aging giant watching the sea lanes tilt away. The warehouses are not empty, but they are less frantic than they used to be. The docks still smell of spice, but not with the old Monopoly's confidence. The monks still chant, but sometimes their voices drift out over waterware. More ships are passing without stopping. You can feel this loss even if you never see a battle. A harbor survives on attention. When attention walks away, the harbor becomes a memory. the old mandala system begins to thin further. Chiefs who once swore oaths under cursed stones now swear new oaths to new patrons, or to nobody at all. The web is no longer snapping dramatically. It is dissolving strand by strand, like rope left too long in salt water. And then Javar moves. Across the Sunda Strait, a new Javanese empire rises, with the confidence Srivijaya once had. The kingdom of Singasari, and later Majapahit, builds fleets and political ambition that don't treat Sumatra as a partner. They treat it as a prize. Java has rice fields, manpower, and a growing warrior elite that wants control of the sea. Lanes the way Srivijaya once did. From a Javanese court, the story looks simple. Srivijaya is a legend that has grown old. The spice route is too valuable to be left in someone else's hands. If you want to be the new master of the seas, you don't ask politely. You take the helm. Majapahit's expansion in the late 1200s and 1300s pushes into Sumatra's orbit, absorbing or neutralizing the remaining Srivijayan influence. Palembang is not necessarily destroyed in a neat cinematic blaze. It is outmaneuvered. Its allies flip. Its tribute dries. Its name becomes more ceremonial than real. And once again, the world doesn't end. It just moves on. Chinese records, always, watching for whoever controls the trade routes, begin treating different Sumatran and Javanese powers as the key players of the day. The old title of Srivijaya becomes fuzzier, less tied to a single throne and more to a region's past prestige. It's like watching a famous family name turn into a ghost story. So where does Srivijaya go? Here's the haunting answer. It goes nowhere. It stays right where it always was, inside the trade wind's memory, inside the river silt, inside the habits of sailors who still use old routes even if they no longer pay old tolls. Srivijaya doesn't vanish like a city swallowed by an earthquake. It fades like a shoreline at high tide. One decade it still matters. The next decade people speak of it in the past tense without realizing they've crossed that line. One generation grows up thinking Srivijaya is a power. The next generation grows up thinking Srivijaya is a story their grandparents told. That's why its disappearance feels so complete, because fading empires don't leave ruins that shout their story. They leave mud, wood, and trade routes that keep moving. Even today, historians still argue about where Srivijaya's true capital sat, because the Musi River changes course, because wooden cities rot into earth, because tropical rain erases monuments faster than deserts do. There is no towering Angkor Wat of Srivijaya, no Borobudur that carries its name in stone. Its greatest architecture was a system, not a temple, a network, not a wall. And when the network dissolves, it leaves little behind for tourists. And yet, Srivijaya's influence never truly died. It shaped the entire logic of maritime Southeast Asia. It proved that oceans can be governed. It trained generations of sailors, pilots, and traders who spread Malay language and culture across islands like seeds. The very idea of the Malay world as a connected sea civilization owes more to Srivijaya than to any later court. So if you live in modern Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, or southern Thailand, and you see how the sea still binds the region together, you're seeing Srivijaya's ghost at work. But let's come back to the mystery we've been carrying since the beginning. If Srivijaya was so powerful, why did it vanish so completely that it took modern archaeology to even prove it existed? Because empires built on water don't collapse the way land empires do. When land empires fall, the city walls remain. The palaces crack, and the story is carved into stone for future strangers to find. But sea empires are made of flow, trust, habit, and fear. They are made of the agreement that this is the place we stop. When that agreement changes, the empire changes with it. Even if the river city is still standing, Srivijaya was, in the deepest sense, a kingdom of motion. It rose by mastering motion, and it died the moment motion stopped needing it. The sea, that crowned it, also carried the crown away. And still, even after all we've traced, one last shadow remains. Somewhere beneath Palembang's mud, in a landscape where rivers braid and unbraid like living things, there are artifacts we haven't found yet. A dock that once held ships bound for China, a monastery foundation buried in silt, a royal cache hidden during a raid and never retrieved, the proof of everyday Srivijaya, waiting for the shovel that hits the right patch of earth. What would we learn if that patch were uncovered tomorrow? A clearer capital map? A lost royal lineage? Evidence of how Srivijaya truly governed its sea world? Or something stranger, something that would force us to rewrite this entire story again? Because here's the final truth about Srivijaya. The ocean that made it powerful also made it secretive. And as long as the music keeps flowing over what lies beneath, the kingdom that once ruled the seas will keep one hand on its last riddle, inviting us to sail back into its fog and ask once more where it really began and what else it still hides.